In 1119, 9 armed men walked into the office of a Middle Eastern king and changed the course of European history without a single sword drawn in anger. Their mission sounded impossible: protect pilgrims on the deadliest roads in Christendom while owning nothing but the clothes on their backs. But within 2 decades, these knights would be richer than kingdoms, commanding armies, running banks, and answering to the Pope himself. How did 9 poor men with vows of poverty become the shadow government of medieval Europe? The answer begins not with money or power, but with bodies stacked like cordwood along dusty roads, where pilgrims went to pray and never came home. Let's step back to where this story truly starts, in 1096, when a Byzantine emperor made a desperate request to the Pope that would unleash forces nobody could control. The First Crusade was Pope Urban II's answer to that plea, a call to retake Jerusalem from Muslim hands after 4 centuries of Islamic rule. Thousands of European knights answered the call, dreaming of glory and redemption in equal measure, and the Pope sweetened the deal by promising them complete forgiveness of sins. What could be more powerful than that? Confess your crimes, kill infidels in the Holy Land, and you'd arrive at heaven's gates with a clean slate. The armies marched east in waves, a chaotic mix of nobles, mercenaries, and religious fanatics who'd never worked together before. They fought through Turkish armies, survived a 3-year siege at Antioch where men starved and ate their own horses, and finally reached Jerusalem in June 1099. What happened next was unforgettable for all the wrong reasons. The conquest was so brutal that contemporary chroniclers literally ran out of words for the violence. The historian Raymond of Aguilera wrote that they waded through blood up to their horses' bridles in the streets of the Holy Land's holiest city. Tens of thousands of Muslims, Jews, and even some Eastern Christians died in a massacre that would echo through the next 1,000 years of history. Bodies piled up in the streets. The Temple Mount ran red. Survivors fled to the rooftops and were hunted like animals. The Al-Aqsa Mosque became a slaughterhouse. Christian soldiers, their religious fervour at a fever pitch, killed indiscriminately. Old men, children, pregnant women, the sick, the infirm. Some chronicles claim the dead numbered nearly 70,000. Others say it was less, but still too many to count. The smell of death hung over the city for weeks. Relatives of the dead came searching for bodies to bury them properly according to Islamic tradition, but found only mass graves. The psychological impact rippled outward. Jerusalem had been conquered, yes, but at what spiritual cost? But here's what the victors hadn't considered. Once you conquer a city, you have to keep it. So the Crusaders did something radical for 1099. They stayed in Jerusalem. They crowned a king, set up administration, and created what historians call the Crusader states, a fragile Christian foothold in a massive Muslim world that wanted them gone. Suddenly something unexpected happened. Pilgrims started coming. Thousands of them. They were ordinary Christians from Europe, merchants, monks, nobles, peasants, even women, all desperate to walk where Jesus walked, to touch the stones he'd touched, to pray in the church of the Holy Sepulchre. This was the obsession of medieval Christianity. Seeing the places where Christ had lived made you feel close to divinity itself. But the journey itself was already deadly. Disease killed more pilgrims than bandits did, but the roads from the Mediterranean ports inland to Jerusalem became hunting grounds for bandits, thieves, and raider bands who'd learned that a pilgrim caravan was easier prey than a merchant convoy. A pilgrim with money was a moving target. A pilgrim alone was a corpse waiting to be found. The journey took weeks or even months through hostile terrain. Caravans disappeared. Solo travellers vanished without a trace. Pilgrims were stripped naked and left to die in the desert or sold into slavery to Arab traders who worked the coasts. The routes turned into what modern observers might call a protection racket, except the protection itself barely existed. One notorious bandit named Saracen Ali operated between Jaffa and Jerusalem, robbing pilgrims on the exact roads they needed to travel to reach the holy sites. He operated with impunity for years because nobody had the force to stop him. Another gang of brigands, mostly Christian outlaws who'd deserted the Crusader armies, ambushed pilgrims near the pass at Montgazard, took everything of value, and left the bodies in a ravine where they weren't discovered, until carrion birds led local monks to the site. A Benedictine abbot from France reported that his pilgrimage group of 38 people was attacked near Ramla. 16 pilgrims were killed before they could even draw swords. The remaining 22 scattered into the hills and took 4 days to find each other again. One woman had been gang-raped and left for dead but survived, traumatized and broken. These weren't rare incidents. They were routine. By 1119, something had to change, and that's where Hugues de Payan appears in the historical record for the first time. Hugues came from Champagne, a region in northern France, and he was a knight of middling importance, not rich, not particularly famous, but motivated by something that drove many younger sons to the Holy Land, the chance to be more than they could ever be at home. He'd travelled to Jerusalem years earlier, around 1104, shortly after the First Crusade's victory, and he'd stayed when others went home. He knew the roads, he'd seen the corpses. He'd spoken to survivors and families who'd lost loved ones to bandits. He'd watched a widow try to explain to her children why their father wasn't coming back. Around 1119, Hugues approached King Baldwin II of Jerusalem with a proposal that seemed crazy at the time. The meeting took place in Baldwin's stone palace in Jerusalem, a fortress that doubled as royal residence. Hugues knelt before the king and spoke carefully, choosing each word. "My lord, I've been thinking about the Pilgrim massacres," Hugues said. "The roads are drowning in blood. We're losing hundreds every year. Good Christians who came to pray." Baldwin II listened, arms crossed, his weathered face showing no emotion. "What of it?" the king asked. "The kingdom can't afford to station soldiers on every road." Hugues nodded. "I'm not proposing soldiers, your majesty. I'm proposing monks." Baldwin's eyebrows rose. "Monks?" "Warrior monks," Hugues continued, gaining confidence. "Men who take monastic vows of poverty, chastity and obedience, but who train as warriors. Men willing to die to protect pilgrims." The king was sceptical. Skilled warriors who took vows of poverty sounded like a contradiction in terms. Why would a powerful knight give up wealth and personal property to live under monastic discipline? Baldwin demanded. That makes no sense. Hugues smiled slightly. It made sense for the Desert Fathers. It makes sense for Cistercians. Why not warrior monks? Because warriors want to enjoy the fruits of their labour, Baldwin replied. Give me another reason. Hugues leaned forward. Because they're serving a higher purpose than themselves, your majesty. Because a man who's given up everything can't be corrupted by gold or threats. And because there are thousands of younger sons in Europe who will never inherit anything, they have nothing to lose and everything to gain from serving you. Baldwin was desperate. He needed to control the roads without paying for a standing army, and he was out of options. The treasury was nearly empty. Maintaining a professional military force would drain resources he didn't have. But doing nothing was political suicide. Pilgrims were dying, their families were telling the story back home, and fewer pilgrims meant fewer donations to the church and fewer Christian visitors to the holy sites. Hugues promised that his order would recruit from across Europe, drawing in younger sons of noble families, men with military training but no inheritance waiting at home. "I can promise them something better than money," Hugues said, leaning back slightly. "Spiritual prestige, a chance to serve God in the most literal sense possible, a seat at the table beside Christ himself." The king sat silent for a long moment, then nodded. "You have my permission. Form your order, but I want results." The king gave his permission, and Hugues assembled his core group, eventually settling on 8 other knights as the founding members besides himself. These weren't names that would echo through history. They were men like Godfrey de Saint-Omer, Payan de Montdidier, and Archibald de Saint-Amand. Nobody remembers them individually, but together they would remake the world. They were practical men, not visionaries. They had no master plan to become rulers of Europe. They simply saw a problem, pilgrims were dying, and committed themselves to solving it. That commitment, that singular focus on a specific mission, would become the foundation of everything that followed. The 9 founders met regularly to discuss their approach and drafted rules for how to patrol, how to respond to attacks, how to treat the pilgrims they protected. They decided to accept donations to fund their operations, reasoning that an order couldn't function without money. The line between the order's wealth and their personal poverty would blur over time, but in those early years, they were sincere in their commitment to their vow. They took vows of poverty, chastity and obedience before the Patriarch of Jerusalem in 1119, the same year that marks the official founding. Their order was called the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, but history would know them as the Knights Templar. The name came from their headquarters. They were granted the Al-Aqsa Mosque, built on the ruins of Solomon's Temple on the Temple Mount itself, the holiest site in Judaism and Islam, now their base of operations. It was incredibly presumptuous, incredibly dangerous, and incredibly strategic. Converting a Muslim mosque into Christian headquarters risked offending the Muslim population of Jerusalem, who weren't conquered so much as coexisting with Christian rule. But the location was perfect. The Temple Mount was defensible, central, and laden with religious symbolism. The Templars took that location and made it their own, transforming a mosque into a fortress and barracks for their growing order. They installed smithies, stables, armories, quarters for knights and sergeants, a chapel for prayer. In the earliest years, they were exactly what they promised to be. 9 men on horses, riding between ports and Jerusalem, trying to intervene when bandits attacked pilgrims. They were outnumbered constantly. They were underfunded completely. The order had almost no money in those early days. The knights shared horses, shared armour, shared everything. Sometimes 3 men would have to take turns with a single destrier, the heavy cavalry horse that was essential for knightly warfare. They'd ride in shifts, one taking the horse while the other 2 walked beside on foot, which defeated the purpose of mounted cavalry but was better than having no horses at all. Their armour was dented, repaired with patches of different metals that didn't match. Their weapons were second-hand or donated. One early roster lists the entire assets of the order as 9 swords, 7 lances, and enough chainmail to outfit 5 men properly. They would see a caravan being robbed and ride toward the attackers anyway, knowing they might not win, knowing the odds were against them, knowing they might die. One early account describes a Templar knight named Robert de Craon standing alone against a raid of 12 bandits, refusing to retreat, buying time for pilgrims to scatter into the desert. That knight died, pierced through by arrows and sword strikes, but 17 pilgrims survived because of his choice. His body was left on the road. Local villagers found it 3 days later and gave him a proper Christian burial, singing his name as a martyr. Another story tells of 2 Templars named Simon and William, who encountered a caravan of 38 pilgrims being attacked by raiders. The Templars were outnumbered 10 to 1, but they charged anyway, screaming their battle cry, their white mantles billowing behind them. They killed 3 bandits before Simon was struck from his horse. William continued fighting even as more bandits surrounded him, protecting Simon's body until reinforcements, other villagers who'd heard the commotion, arrived. Both Templars survived that encounter, wounded and bleeding, but so did the pilgrims. These stories, whether literally true or carefully constructed propaganda, became the foundation of the Templar legend. Word spread back to Europe that there was an order of knights dedicated entirely to pilgrim protection, that they took monastic vows seriously, that they were willing to die for people they'd never met. Word travelled through noble courts, through monastery scriptoriums, through taverns where knights gathered. A Templar was a monk and a warrior, something nobody had seen before. Young men started volunteering. Younger sons with no inheritance, younger siblings of lords, even some men of rank who wanted spiritual purpose more than secular power. Noble families started donating land and money to support the order. By the mid-1120s, the Templars had grown from 9 men to perhaps 50 or 60 knights, with many more support staff, squires, sergeants, blacksmiths, stable hands, and administrators. But they had a legitimacy problem in the eyes of the established church. Monastic orders followed the rule of St. Benedict, written in the 6th century, which emphasized contemplation and prayer over violence. Even the military orders that did exist, like the hospital brothers who ran pilgrim hospitals, weren't supposed to be warriors first. The Templars were something new and potentially dangerous, monks who fought, who owned horses and weapons, who answered to a military structure rather than traditional monastic hierarchy. Pope Honorius II was sceptical. So were most bishops. Could an order dedicated to violence actually be living according to Christ's teachings? In 1129, King Baldwin II called a council at the city of Troyes in Champagne, Eudes de Payon's home region, to address the Templar question officially. The council brought together bishops, archbishops, and powerful church officials from across Europe. The Templars sent representatives, including Hughes himself, to make their case before men who would decide whether they lived or died as an institution. But the most important person at Troyes wasn't a king or a bishop. It was Bernard of Clairvaux, a young Cistercian monk who'd become the most influential religious voice in all of Christendom. Bernard was famous for his charisma, his theological brilliance, and his ability to persuade Rome on anything he cared about. At 35 years old, he already had the ear of the Pope and the respect of every major monastery in Europe. He was also, historians suspect, connected to Hugues de Payan through family ties, though the exact relationship remains unclear. Bernard listened to the Templars' proposal and became their champion. He gave speeches defending their right to exist as a military order. In one famous moment, as the council debated on the second day, Bernard stood and addressed the assembly directly. The room fell silent. His voice was quiet, but it carried. "You say monks should not fight? I ask you, should Christians not fight when their brothers are slaughtered on the roads? Should faith not defend itself when pagans attack the faithful? The Templars are Christ's soldiers in the truest sense." He paused, letting his words sink in, his eyes moving across the faces of cardinals and bishops. "These men take monastic vows not to hide from the world but to engage with it. They are more pure than any hermit, because they face temptation and struggle every day and choose Christ anyway. A hermit hides in a cave and prays. A Templar stands in the blood and mud and makes the choice to serve God anyway." He gestured toward Hugues and the other Templar representatives. "You want to deny these men legitimacy? Then you deny legitimacy to the crusade itself. You deny that Christian soldiers can serve both God and the sword. But I tell you this, a Christian who kills a Muslim trying to murder pilgrims is not a murderer. He is a martyr in waiting, a servant of Christ engaged in the most holy work." One bishop stood to argue, citing canon law against monks bearing weapons. Bernard responded without hesitation. "Canon law was written in peace. We are in war. The law serves men, not men the law. If the law prevents us from saving Christian lives, then we must look to a higher authority, the Pope, God's representative on earth. And if the Pope says they may fight, then they may fight." He argued that killing infidels wasn't sinful when done in service of Christ, that their vows made them more pure than traditional monks, that they represented the future of Christendom's defence. His support was decisive. The Council of Troyes officially recognised the Templars as a legitimate military order of the Church, the first of its kind. More importantly, Bernard wrote the Rule of the Templars, a detailed document governing everything from how they dressed to what they ate to how they should behave in battle. That rule became the foundation of every Templar regulation for the next 2 centuries. It was written in Latin, formal and specific, and covered everything. Pope Honorius II, influenced by Bernard's endorsement, issued a papal bull in 1129 officially recognising the Templars and placing them under direct papal protection, rather than under the authority of local bishops or kings. This was extraordinary. It meant the Templars answered to the Pope himself, not to secular rulers, which gave them an independence that no other military force in Christendom possessed. Kings could challenge bishops, popes could challenge kings, but nobody could challenge the Templars without going through Rome first. The rule Bernard wrote was surprisingly strict. Templars were forbidden to gamble, to drink heavily, to visit brothels, to wear bright colours or fancy clothes. They were required to attend religious services daily, to sleep in a dormitory rather than private chambers, to eat in silence while someone read scripture. The reader would stand in the dining hall while knights consumed their meal, typically just bread and vegetables, listening to holy words instead of conversation. They had to ask permission to leave their compound, even for brief journeys. They were forbidden to hunt except lions, which made theological sense to the medieval mind. Lions were seen as noble, worthy opponents, while other hunting was considered frivolous. They had to maintain specific armour and equipment, nothing more or less. They took vows of obedience that were absolute, meaning a superior officer's command superseded their personal judgment. If a superior told them to charge a superior force, they charged. If a superior told them to accept a ransom offer or reject it, they obeyed without question. Yet within this rigid structure, something unexpected grew, a meritocracy. Unlike European feudal society, where birth determined everything, Templars could rise through the ranks based on ability. A peasant boy who showed military skill could eventually become a knight commander. This attracted ambitious men who had no other way to gain status. It also meant that Templar commanders were often terrifyingly effective because they'd been selected for competence rather than noble blood. The physical symbol of all this was their distinctive white mantle with a red cross, the Tau cross or Jerusalem cross depending on the region. The white represented purity and obedience. The red cross represented Christ's blood and readiness to die. When a knight was formally inducted into the order, he'd kneel before the Templar master in the commandery chapel, the white mantle laid across a table beside him. The chapel would be crowded with other Templars watching, witnessing, holding the moment sacred, The master would ask 3 times, "Do you come to join the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, dedicating your life, your property, and your future to Christ's service?" 3 times the knight would answer, "Yes, by God's grace." Then the master would place that white mantle on his shoulders while saying the words that made the commitment absolute. The white fabric would feel heavy, heavier than it actually was, weighted down by history and oath and the eyes of every man in that room. From that moment, he was a Templar until death. He owned nothing. His horse wasn't his, it was the Order's. His sword wasn't his, it was the Order's. His childhood home wasn't his anymore, his family wasn't his anymore, his life wasn't his, it was the Order's. When a knight put on that white mantle, he died to his old self. From that point forward, he was property of the Order. What he gained instead was purpose, brotherhood, and the promise that if he died in service, he'd go directly to heaven with no purgatory. For medieval Christians, that was a promise worth more than gold. That promise was concrete, guaranteed, blessed by the Pope himself. Die as a Templar and your soul was assured salvation. No confessions needed, no penance required. Your blood paid for your sins. The psychological effect of this promise was staggering. A Templar knight in battle knew with absolute certainty that if he died, he'd be welcomed into paradise. This made them fearless in a way ordinary soldiers weren't. A regular soldier might hesitate before charging a superior force. A Templar knight charged anyway, believing his death would be redeemed instantly. It was a recruitment pitch of almost incomparable power. The recruitment pitch worked across Europe. Templars established their first commandery in England around 1128, then France, then Spain, then the Holy Roman Empire. They targeted knights, but they also took donations from merchants, landowners, and even bishops who wanted to support the mission but couldn't leave their posts. Wealthy nobles donated estates, kings donated forests, merchants donated money. By 1150, the order had grown so quickly that they couldn't simply live off donated property anymore. They needed a structure to manage their resources, to move money between their scattered commanderies, to keep their records organised. What they built in response would become the medieval world's first international banking system, but that story belongs to part 2 of this series. For now, understand that in just 3 decades, 9 poor soldiers of Christ had grown their organisation into a multinational institution, with headquarters on the holiest ground in Christendom, and chapters spread across every Catholic kingdom in Europe. They recruited thousands, they owned castles, they controlled roads, they answered to nobody but the Pope, and most importantly, they were united by something stronger than any law or contract. They believed they were doing God's work, and God's work meant that even breaking the laws of men was justified. But here's the question that would haunt them for the next 2 centuries. What happens when an organisation becomes so powerful that it threatens the very kings who created it? What happens when an order dedicated to poverty becomes unimaginably wealthy? What happens when warriors sworn to obedience start making their own decisions about life and death? The answers would lead to secret trials, accusations of heresy, the torture of the order's leaders, and ultimately to the most dramatic fall from grace in medieval history. But before we reach that darkness, we need to understand how the Templars built something that shouldn't have been possible. A financial system that moved money across continents in an age before modern banking, before computers, before anything that resembled the infrastructure of international commerce. We need to follow Hugues de Payan into the corridors of power, watch as popes and kings became dependent on Templar money, and trace the exact moment when the order stopped being servants to Christendom and started being rulers of it. By 1150, they weren't just protecting pilgrims anymore, they were protecting themselves, and no force on earth seemed capable of stopping them. The white mantle with its red cross had become the uniform of something dangerous, something unstoppable, something that would eventually have to be destroyed. For now, in these early decades, the Templars believed themselves invincible, beloved by the Church, trusted by Christian rulers, essential to Christendom's survival. They didn't yet understand that their power was already beginning to corrupt them, that the vows that had seemed so pure and so binding would start to feel like chains, and that the secrets they were keeping would eventually demand a reckoning that would shake kingdoms to their foundations. By the 1150s, something extraordinary was happening inside Templar properties across Europe, something that would reshape how money itself moved. A pilgrim named Arnaud stood in a commandery outside Paris, his leather purse heavy with coins, dangerously heavy. Bandits owned these roads. Armies swept through territories without warning. One wrong turn, one night sleeping under the wrong tree, and everything he'd saved to visit Jerusalem would vanish. He approached a Templar priest and spoke the words that would change everything. "I need to get this safely to the Holy Land." The priest nodded, gesturing toward a wooden desk covered in ledgers and sealed parchment. He'd heard this countless times. "We can do better than your purse," he said, pulling out a letter written in precise Latin characters. "How much do you carry?" Arnaud counted slowly. 85 gold pieces, the price of years of labour. 85, the priest repeated, writing the amount in his ledger with careful strokes. "Good, now watch." The priest retrieved a small lead seal from a locked box beneath the desk, shaped like a Templar cross, weighing roughly an ounce. He heated the seal over a candle until it glowed orange, then pressed it into red wax at the bottom of Arnaud's letter. "No one in Christendom can fake this seal," the priest explained, holding it up to the candlelight to show the intricate cross-hatching. "We change them every 3 months. If they match, you get your money. If they don't, you lose everything." Arnaud examined the seal, seeing the precise detail work that would take a master craftsman hours to replicate. "What if someone captures me and steals the letter?" The priest smiled grimly. "They'd have worthless parchment. The letter requires you to describe the receiving Templar house and recite a phrase in Arabic that only our Jerusalem Knights know. A bandit couldn't possibly know it. We've designed this so that only you can use it." Arnaud nodded, handing over his 85 pieces of gold. The priest placed them in a heavy iron box, locked it with a key, and recorded the transaction in his ledger with the date, Arnaud's name, and a description. Pilgrim, brown beard, scar on left hand. He made a second copy of the letter on separate parchment and filed it away in a leather folder. "This copy goes to Jerusalem by a different route," the priest explained. "If your letter is lost at sea, you can arrive in Jerusalem, provide your description, and we'll have a record here of your deposit." Arnaud nodded, understanding the sophistication of this system. "Give us your money here. We'll give you a letter. In Jerusalem, you walk into any Templar house, show this letter, and withdraw exactly what you gave us, in local currency, same value, no loss." Arnaud held the parchment. It was worth more than gold. It was worth more than his life. This simple transaction, this letter of credit, was the birth of modern banking, invented not by merchants, but by warrior monks who swore vows of poverty. The irony would eventually kill them. By 1200, the Templars operated what historians now call the first international banking network. Need money in 5 different kingdoms? Before the Templars, you faced catastrophe. Currency exchange rates that robbed you blind, merchants who'd fleece you, corrupt money changers who shaved coins down to nothing. The Templars eliminated all of it. Their system was breathtaking in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. A merchant in Bruges named Hubert wanted to buy goods in Alexandria, fine linen, spices, rare dyes, sandalwood from Egypt. Carrying 40,000 gold pieces through brigand territories meant certain death. Instead, he went to the Templars in Bruges with his merchant partner Thomas, who did most of the talking. "We need credit transfer to Alexandria," Thomas said, placing heavy leather bags on the Templar banker's table. The Templar, a grizzled commander named Bernard who'd served in the Holy Land for 23 years, barely glanced at the bags. "How much total?" 40,000 gold pieces, Thomas replied, his voice steady but his hands showing tension. Bernard nodded slightly, unsurprised. "We transferred 90,000 last month alone to a single Venetian trader." He pulled out a leather ledger bound in calfskin and dipped his quill in iron gall ink. "Names?" "Hubert of Bruges and Thomas of Ghent," Thomas said. Bernard wrote swiftly, his hand moving with practiced precision, recording the amount and the names in a cipher that neither merchant could decipher, even if they watched him write. He pulled another parchment from a carved wooden shelf and began writing in clear Latin, then switched to symbols and marks, a private Templar code that used geometric shapes and dots to encode information about the transaction, the merchants, and the destination. After 15 minutes of careful writing, he sealed the letter with 2 different seals, a red wax seal for authenticity, a lead seal for security. "Take this to our Alexandria house," Bernard said, sliding the letter across the table. "They'll know you're legitimate. The exchange rate is 12% better than anything you'd get from local money changers. We take 1.25% commission. you'll emerge with 43,800 pieces of Alexandrian dinar equivalent, more than you'd make in a year of trading otherwise. Thomas and Hubert exchanged glances. And if we lose the letter, Hubert asked, voicing the concern that kept merchants awake at night. Bernard shrugged. Then you lose 40,000 pieces of gold. This is your incentive to protect it. We don't take responsibility for theft, only for honouring what's written here. But our security is excellent. No merchant has ever lost a letter that I'm aware of. Thomas folded the letter carefully into his tunic, feeling the weight of 40,000 pieces worth of parchment. We've done business with the Italians. They demand 5% commission, and their rates are terrible. The Italians aren't protected by every Catholic king from London to Jerusalem, Bernard replied, leaning back in his chair. We are. Safe passage comes at a price. Kings can't touch our ships. Lords can't steal from our caravans. That protection costs money, and it's worth every dinar you pay us. The two merchants left with their letter, travelling carefully overland through France and Italy, then shipping across the Mediterranean. 3 weeks later, they walked into the Alexandria Templar house, a fortress overlooking the Mediterranean harbour, constructed of limestone blocks fitted so precisely you couldn't slide a coin between them. The building rose 4 stories with arrow slits every 6 feet. The roof had catapult positions. The front gate was a massive wooden construction reinforced with iron bands and operated by a counterweight system that required 4 men to open. The commander there, a weathered veteran named Richard with a scarred face and missing 2 fingers on his left hand, examined the letter immediately. He said nothing, simply produced an identical cipher key from a locked wooden box, compared every mark and symbol with meticulous care, checking the seal marks against his records, and nodded. 40,000 pieces worth, Richard said. Your names match. The seal is correct. The transaction code here matches last month's archive. You're legitimate merchants. He gestured to an assistant who returned with a canvas bag heavy enough to require both hands. Local currency and credit notes good throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. The notes can be exchanged at any Templar house from here to Constantinople. Hubert opened the bag slightly and saw gold, silver and stamped parchment, Templar credit notes that functioned as cash. The notes had the same security features as the transfer letter. Multiple seals, coded writing, specific weight and thickness of paper that couldn't be replicated. They walked out of the Alexandria house 300% wealthier than they'd entered, their 40,000 pieces now transformed into goods they could actually buy. The Templars took 1.25% and recorded the transaction in Alexandria's ledger, then sent monthly reports back to Paris where the international accounts were reconciled. The Paris counting house processed thousands of transactions monthly. They maintained separate ledgers for each region. They calculated running balances. They tracked which commanders had access to which vault levels. They prepared financial statements that showed the order's total assets and liabilities with precision that wouldn't be matched by any secular organisation for another 300 years. Here's what made this system revolutionary. It broke the stranglehold that local lords and currency traders held over commerce. Before the Templars, kings basically owned your ability to trade across borders. They could refuse you passage. They could seize your goods. They could devalue their currency to punish you. The Templars operated outside this structure. Their properties had royal protections. No lord could simply steal from them, and this made them the first truly neutral financial institutions. Merchants of all nations could use them. Crusaders heading to Jerusalem trusted them. Even enemies traded through Templar houses because both sides knew the Templars cared about nothing except the transaction itself and its precise recording in their ledgers. By 1180, the Paris Temple had become the financial capital of Europe, something no one had predicted. Not Rome, not even the royal treasuries. Paris, a fortress within Paris, actually. The temple occupied over 20 acres in the northern district, surrounded by a massive stone wall 20 feet high and 6 feet thick. Inside this wall stood the main sanctuary, a circular church modelled on the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, with a massive treasury tower beside it, 10 stories tall, with iron-banded doors and arrow slits every 3 feet. The tower's lower levels were sealed vaults. The first level down from ground contained deposits from French nobility. The second level held the royal treasury, when kings actually deposited their money there. The third and fourth levels held crusader deposits, pilgrim fees, and merchant reserves. The fifth level down existed only in Templar records. Even high-ranking knights didn't know what they contained. likely early artifacts from the Holy Land or treasure seized from enemies. The vaults themselves were protected with medieval security that bordered on paranoia. Each vault required 3 separate keys held by different senior commanders. The locks were mechanical contraptions with pins and tumblers that had to be aligned precisely. A single mistake locked the mechanism harder. The floors were waxed and polished constantly. A footprint lasting more than a few minutes meant an intruder. The walls were embedded with listening tubes, hollow pipes built into the stone, so guards above could hear any movement below. The vaults had narrow entrances that forced anyone entering to move slowly, giving guards time to react to intruders. Guards rotated in shifts of 4, stationed at all times at the main entrance and throughout the vault passages. Every transaction was witnessed by at least 2 guards and a senior clerk. The security wasn't just physical, it was procedural. Nothing moved without documentation. Nothing was recorded without verification. This combination of architecture, procedure, and personnel made the Paris Temple the safest place to store value in all of medieval Europe. A merchant who stored gold there slept soundly, knowing his wealth was guarded by men sworn to protect it, locked behind mechanisms no human could penetrate, and recorded in ledgers that would survive even if the guards fell. A Templar chronicle from the era describes the Paris Temple with barely concealed amazement. In the Paris Temple, the gold of Christendom accumulates. Kings consult there before spending their own treasuries. The vaults contain more wealth than Rome itself. The locks cannot be breached. The guards are eternal. That's not exaggeration. The Paris counting house employed over 300 clerks, whose sole job was recording transactions, reconciling accounts, and maintaining the ledgers that tracked every denier of Templar wealth. Clerks worked in shifts. The record-keeping never stopped. A room occupied the second floor of the administrative tower, filled with filing cases constructed from oak, each case divided into compartments for specific regions: France, England, the Holy Lands, Flanders, Burgundy, Spain. The lead clerk, an elderly master named Etienne who'd been with the order for 40 years, maintained the master ledger, a massive tome bound in leather, containing the running totals of all Templar accounts. Each evening Etienne would update the master ledger with the day's transactions. Each month he'd calculate the balance. Each year he'd compile a financial statement showing the order's total assets. By 1250, the master ledger showed assets exceeding 3 million gold pieces equivalent, more wealth than any organization in human history had accumulated, with only the Catholic Church rival in sheer capital. The Templars had become more than bankers. They'd become the physical embodiment of capital itself. Kings did consult the Templars. They had to. The Templars held their money. Philip II of France, called Philip Augustus, one of the greatest medieval kings, needed to finance wars against England and the Holy Roman Empire simultaneously. He couldn't do it without the Templars. They'd lent him enormous sums. In 1190, during the Third Crusade, Philip borrowed over 60,000 livres from the Templars, more money than most kingdoms could mint in a year. The interest was brutal by modern standards, 30% of the borrowed amount payable within 3 years. Philip took it. He had no choice. The accounting was precise: 60,000 livres principal, 18,000 livres interest, due in 36 monthly payments of 2,166 livres. He paid exactly on schedule, and immediately borrowed another 90,000 livres at 25% interest to finance his wars against the English King Richard's holdings in Normandy. The Templars, sitting in their vault towers, knew every denier of Philip's debt. They knew his monthly revenues. They knew when he was running short. They adjusted his credit lines based on his military performance and tax receipts. They were, in essence, running the finances of the most powerful kingdom in Christendom. Henry III of England, one of the longest-reigning English monarchs, did the same thing repeatedly. His debts to the Templars ballooned so severely that by 1240, the Templars essentially owned chunks of his kingdom in the form of seized lands and revenue streams. When Henry failed to pay 45,000 marks in 1238, the Templars didn't send armies they didn't need to. They controlled his credit. They refused his next loan request. Suddenly, Henry couldn't pay his mercenaries. He couldn't provision his castles. Within weeks, he was negotiating new terms. The Templars would forgive 20,000 marks owed in exchange for the revenue streams from 3 English ports for the next 7 years. Henry signed. He had no choice. The ports, Southampton, Portsmouth and Bristol, generated approximately 3,000 marks annually. Over 7 years, the Templars would extract 21,000 marks while forgiving 20,000, netting an additional 1,000 marks profit and gaining permanent influence over English maritime commerce. No king could wage war without credit. No king could expand his territory, build his castles, maintain his armies without borrowed money. The Templars understood this before anyone else. Money wasn't wealth to them anymore. Control was. Control of credit. Control of currency flow. Control of which kingdoms could afford to exist. They'd become gatekeepers of power itself. The network that made this possible was almost absurdly vast. The Templars owned over 9,000 properties across Europe by 1250. Not just churches and fortresses, farms, vineyards, mills, forests, entire estates with villages on them. In England, they owned so much land that they could feed their order for months without buying a single grain from outside. Their English properties produced enough grain to feed 30,000 people annually. In France, their vineyards produced wine shipped across Europe, over 50,000 barrels per year. Their mills ground grain for entire regions. Peasants paid taxes in grain that went to Templar mills. They weren't just bankers, they were an economic superpower with physical assets everywhere. A person could travel from England to Jerusalem and never leave Templar land. They could sleep in a Templar house every single night, eat their bread, drink their wine, wear their clothes. The Templars didn't just move money, they moved goods. They had a fleet of ships operating in the Mediterranean and along Atlantic coasts. These weren't military vessels like later maritime powers would build. These were merchant ships, but armed. They transported grain, wine, armour, pilgrims, and gold. The hull of a Templar merchant vessel called the Trinity of St. George, constructed in 1195, could carry 40 tons of cargo and 50 passengers. It had oars for rowing through calms and a massive rectangular sail for ocean crossing. The deck had reinforced fighting positions with small catapults mounted on swivels. The hold was divided into compartments to prevent cargo shifts during storms. A document from 1247 lists the Templar fleet. 3 vessels in Naples carrying wine and grain for distribution, 2 in Genoa transporting French pilgrims and Templar correspondents to Syria, 4 based in Sicily for eastern Mediterranean routes connecting to ports in Alexandria, 1 in Marseille serving as a floating warehouse for incoming Crusader supplies, and 2 in Cyprus preparing for Jerusalem trade routes. That's just the recorded ones. The Templars deliberately kept their total shipping capacity secret, a deliberate strategy to maintain mystery about their true economic power. A monastic order wasn't supposed to command naval forces, merchants weren't supposed to swear religious vows, yet here were the Templars, operating a merchant fleet as efficient as anything run by Italian traders, while simultaneously maintaining their status as monks. And here's the crucial part. While most medieval organizations spent everything they made, the Templars accumulated. They reinvested profits. They didn't drain their properties for personal luxury. Templar knights took vows of poverty, and this vow, enforced through the order's internal hierarchy, meant wealth wasn't dissipated on private indulgence. It was concentrated, it was deployed, it compounded. By 1260, the Templars possessed wealth equivalent to several modern nations. An estimation from historical records suggests the order's total assets, property, precious metals, goods in storage, outstanding loans and vessels, would have equaled roughly the annual revenue of France itself. They owned approximately 900,000 acres of land across Europe. Their liquid assets totaled over 2 million gold pieces. Their outstanding loans to various kings exceeded 1.5 million gold pieces. Let that land. A monastic order owned as much wealth as the richest kingdom in Christendom. Kings noticed, kings resented, kings feared. Yet the power dynamic deepened further when Templar knights started living like nobility, while still preaching poverty. A Templar commander in Paris received, by the order's official rules, the same simple tunic and modest rations as any junior knight, except the commander lived in a stone manor house with 40 servants. He ate meat regularly, pork, beef, venison, while the vows supposedly restricted him to bread and water during Lent. He wore the finest linen under his white mantle. When he travelled, 50 armed knights accompanied him. His personal library contained books that cost more than peasant villages. He slept on a bed frame with a feather mattress, a luxury forbidden to most monks. The vow of poverty had become a technical exercise. Templar commanders didn't personally own these things. The order owned them. The vow simply meant you couldn't claim personal property. But the order claimed everything, and then gave its commanders access to everything. A contemporary critic, a monk named Stephen of Bourbon who served in a Dominican monastery, wrote in his chronicle with clear resentment, "The Templars swear vows of poverty before God, yet they live like princes. They own cities like lords. They refuse payment of taxes like kings. Where is the poverty? Where is the sacrifice? I see only vanity dressed in white mantles, greed blessed by Rome." His words captured a growing anger throughout Christendom. The Templars had stopped being monks. They had become something else entirely, a military corporation with a monastic facade. And the problem kept growing. Every king they loaned to resented them. Every payment they demanded felt like extraction. Every interest rate increase felt like theft. Philip IV of France, called Philip the Fair, though fairness wasn't his trademark, inherited a throne drowning in debt, much of it owed to the Templars. His grandfather, Louis IX, had been deeply pious and comfortable with Templar power. Philip was neither. He was a pragmatist confronting a bankruptcy crisis. By 1295, French royal debt to the Templars was approximately 500,000 livres, more than the entire annual tax revenue of France. Specific debts were recorded precisely: 150,000 livres from a crusade financing agreement dated 1280, 180,000 livres from military operations in Flanders in 1292, 95,000 livres from the Gascon Wars against England, 75,000 livres in accumulated interest. Philip had a choice: repay impossible debt or eliminate the creditor. He chose neither. He chose something worse. He chose to destroy them. A chronicler close to the French court recorded Philip's frustration in terms that sound almost modern. "The king controls no gold because the gold controls the king. The Templars sit in Paris, take the kingdom's revenue, and distribute it according to their will. A king should not be servant to monks. The treasury is empty. The Templars grew fat on what should belong to the crown. They are not bankers. They are usurpers wearing crosses." Philip wasn't alone in his rage. The Duke of Burgundy owed the Templars 65,000 marks. The Count of Flanders owed them 40,000 marks. Every major noble in France owed them. They'd created a system so profitable, so vast, that they'd essentially become the shadow government of Europe. They issued credit notes that kings and merchants trusted more than royal currency. They set exchange rates that determined commerce. They could accelerate or break any kingdom's economy by adjusting their interest rates or their credit availability. And like all systems that accumulate too much power, it was building toward a catastrophic collision. The tension had been mounting for decades. Smaller nobles who owed the Templars money would whisper resentfully to each other at court gatherings. Bishops who resented Templar independence from church authority complained to the Pope. Merchants who couldn't compete with Templar financial services grumbled about unfair advantages. But none of this would have mattered except for one simple fact. Philip IV had run out of options. His treasury was empty. His debts were staggering. His only way forward was through the vaults of Paris. If he could somehow seize the Templar wealth, he could solve his financial crisis. If he could publicly destroy them, he could reshape the power dynamics of Europe. If he could do it quickly and convincingly, no other creditor would dare threaten him again. The irony was devastating. The banking system the Templars had invented would destroy them. For centuries they'd moved money by recording transactions in ledgers. They'd created the infrastructure of credit. They'd made themselves indispensable. But they'd also created a paper trail. Every transaction was documented. Every loan was recorded. Every debt was written down. This documentation, which had been their strength, proof of their fairness, evidence of their legitimacy, would become their vulnerability. Philip would use their own records against them. The Templars had solved the problem of moving money across medieval Christendom. They'd become indispensable. They'd become rich beyond measure. They'd become accustomed to wielding power that made kings uncomfortable. But they'd made a fatal error. They'd stopped remembering that they existed at the pleasure of kings, and that kings, given enough pressure, would always choose survival over debt. By 1300, Philip IV was already planning something quiet, something that would require the cooperation of the Pope himself, something that would redefine what could happen when a king decided a creditor had simply accumulated too much power. He'd consult with his lawyers, he'd build his case methodically, he'd begin spreading rumours, whispers really, about Templar heresy, about strange rituals performed in their vaults, about secret gods they worshipped. The narratives didn't have to be true, they just had to be believable. He began assembling evidence against them, building a case that would frame the Templars not as bankers or lords, but as heretics, men who worshipped strange gods, denied Christ, and used their wealth for blasphemous purposes. It didn't matter if it was true. What mattered was that Philip controlled the narrative. He had soldiers, he had lawyers, he had time, he had desperation. The Templars, who'd invented banking, were about to discover what it meant to owe money to someone with nothing left to lose. By 1305, King Philip IV of France faced a problem that kept him awake at night. Actually, several problems, but one consumed him entirely. He owed the Templars enormous sums of money. The military order had become something far more sophisticated than warriors. They were international bankers, moneylenders, and custodians of wealth that made even kingdoms appear modest by comparison. Philip had borrowed heavily to fund his wars against Flanders and England, campaigns that drained his treasury while swelling the Templar coffers. Each payment meant humiliation. Each debt reminder felt like a noose tightening around his authority. The French king wasn't a man who accepted subordination to anyone, certainly not to an organisation answerable only to Rome. His advisor Guillaume de Nogaret whispered constantly in his ear, suggesting solutions. Nogaret was clever, ruthless, and bound by complete loyalty to Philip alone, exactly the kind of instrument a desperate monarch needed. The two men began plotting, not as mere debtors seeking forgiveness, but as conspirators planning something far darker and more systematic than simple financial relief. What they were about to execute would shake Christendom to its core and erase an entire military order from the pages of history in what would later be remembered as one of the great catastrophes of medieval Europe. The plan was audacious because it had to be. Anything less would fail. They needed the Pope on their side, or at minimum his non-interference. They needed Templar Grand Master Jacques de Molay arrested before word could spread. They needed charges so serious that defending the order would seem heretical itself. Most importantly, they needed it done all at once, everywhere in France simultaneously. Dawn raids that would catch every Templar off guard before they could hide assets or escape. The timing had to be perfect, and Philip was patient. He spent months preparing the trap, gathering testimonies from disgruntled former Templars, from people with grudges, from anyone whose words might form the foundation of accusations. Heresy was the charge that would stick. Heresy transcended mere debt disputes and moved into the realm of cosmic danger. Nogaret and Philip crafted a narrative so inflammatory that even if later disproven, it would embed itself in popular consciousness. The Templars were devil worshippers. They spat upon the cross. They worshipped some mysterious idol called the Baphomet. They engaged in sodomy and blasphemous rituals. The accusations were mostly fabricated, drawn from jealousy and medieval paranoia, but they were precisely designed to horrify the Church and common people alike. The Templars mock Christ in secret chambers, Nogaret reportedly declared, and such words, once spoken, spread like poison through a body. Philip began moving his pieces into position with the calculated precision of a chess master. He couldn't just arrest them. That would raise immediate resistance from the Church and from Templar sympathisers throughout Europe. Instead, he worked behind the scenes to ensure that Pope Clement V, who was largely dependent on French support anyway, would at least turn a blind eye to what was coming. Clement was a weakling by most accounts, a pope more concerned with maintaining his position than defending the Church's traditional allies. He initially resisted Philip's pressure, understanding that attacking the Templars would damage the Crusades and the entire framework of Church military cooperation that had sustained Christendom for 2 centuries. But Philip was relentless. The king didn't make requests, he made demands. Clement found himself backed into an impossible corner, caught between his loyalty to an institution he had served all his life and his basic need to survive politically. The year 1307 arrived. October approached. Philip and Nogaret finalised every detail. Letters were sealed, to be opened simultaneously across France on a specified date and hour. The message was clear and devastating. Arrest every Templar you can find, seize all their property, and hold them for interrogation on charges of heresy and blasphemy. Friday, October the 13th, 1307, dawned like any other autumn morning in France, but it would be remembered forever as the day an entire empire collapsed. Before dawn broke over the French landscape, armed men were already moving. They surrounded Templar preceptories and commanderies throughout the realm, positioned at gates, at windows, at the very edges of walls. Some Templars woke to find soldiers blocking every exit from their dormitories, swords drawn, patience non-existent. Others were arrested while at prayer in their chapels, their horses still saddled from morning patrols. At the preceptory of Vitry, soldiers smashed through the chapel door during lauds, scattering monks mid-prayer. One account describes a captain stepping over the altar to reach a knight standing in the sanctuary, armed guards flanking him left and right. "By order of the king," the captain said coldly, and the arrest was made. The coordinated nature of the operation astounded observers. It was a precision strike that couldn't have been executed without months of planning and perfect synchronization. By the time the sun fully rose, hundreds of Templars were in custody, separated from their brothers, placed in dungeons awaiting interrogation. The Grand Master himself, Jacques de Molay, was arrested at the Preceptory of Paris, a man in his 60s who had led the order for 23 years and had personally travelled to the Holy Land multiple times. De Molay was taken to a tower in the Marais district of Paris, placed in chains, and confronted immediately with accusations that seemed to come from nowhere. Accusations so serious, so bizarre, that at first he thought the whole affair was a terrible misunderstanding that would be cleared up within hours. He was wrong. The interrogation began immediately. De Molay initially denied everything. The charges were so absurd that his refusal seemed reasonable. But the inquisitors had been given specific instructions from Philip himself. Extract confessions at any cost, by any method, without hesitation or mercy. Torture became the method of conversation. The medieval period's understanding of justice held that a confession extracted through extreme pain held greater weight than simple denials, as if suffering itself possessed the power to unlock truth. What followed was calculated brutality. De Molay's feet were burned with hot irons, the soles of his feet exposed to flames until the skin blackened and burst. His body was twisted on the strappado, a device that dislocated joints slowly, methodically, extending the agony across hours rather than minutes. Weights were attached to his limbs, then suspended, stretching muscles until they tore from bone. Extremity after extremity was subjected to pain calculated to break not just his body but his will, his mind, his sense of reality itself. After days of this, some accounts say 2 days, others say 5, broken and desperate, Jacques de Molay confessed to charges he hadn't committed. He admitted to spitting on the cross. He described worshipping a bearded head called the Baphomet. He confessed to denying Christ. He spoke of sodomy within the order. His confession was written down, witnessed, and sealed as evidence. Later, when the immediate torture ceased, de Molay retracted everything. "I confessed because I could not bear the pain any longer," he told his interrogators. But then the torture resumed. They burned him again. They twisted him again. The choice was simple: recant and suffer, or confess and achieve temporary respite. Eventually the mind breaks under such treatment. De Molay confessed again. Philip circulated these confessions throughout France and beyond, presenting them as absolute proof of Templar heresy. Other arrested Templars, facing similar torture, also confessed to the same charges with such identical consistency that it should have raised immediate suspicion. Instead, it seemed to deepen the conviction that something terrible had indeed been happening in secret Templar chambers. Some historians now believe that tortured prisoners were actually given copies of the accusations beforehand, so their confessions simply parroted what they'd been told to say. The fact that the confessions perfectly matched the charges rather than containing unique details should have been the first clue that something was profoundly wrong, but logic bent under pressure. Pope Clement watched these developments with growing dismay. He had expected intimidation, some show of force, but not this. Not a full-scale, systematic destruction of a church military order. His initial resistance hardened into something approaching defiance. "The Templars are innocent," he insisted to Philip in letters that still survive in archives. The Pope began investigating the charges independently and found them wanting. The Inquisition, technically answerable to Rome rather than to secular monarchs, took testimony and largely dismissed the heresy allegations as unproven. Clement sent envoys to speak with imprisoned Templars and found them recanting their confessions. "Torture forced me to say things that are lies," one Templar told the papal envoy, his voice raw from screaming. Another declared, "I would confess to anything, to murdering God himself if the burning would stop. For a moment it appeared that Clement might actually stand firm against Philip, that he might dissolve the whole operation and free the prisoners. But Philip was experienced at applying pressure in ways that didn't require shouting or threats. He reminded Clement of the financial support that France provided to the papacy. He suggested that other accusations might come to light, accusations about papal corruption or about the Pope's own moral failings. He demonstrated that Clement's position in Rome itself might become precarious if he continued to resist the will of the French crown. These conversations didn't leave written records, but their effect was unmistakable. Clement began to waver. By 1310, the Pope had essentially surrendered to Philip's will. He still maintained the Templars' innocence in private communications, but publicly he ceased to defend them. The Church tacitly accepted that the order would cease to exist, that its wealth would be forfeited, and that no investigation would be allowed to undermine the charges against them. This capitulation marked a turning point in European politics. It demonstrated that even the Church could be bent to the will of secular power when pressure was applied systematically and without mercy. The Council of Vienne convened in 1312, a major ecclesiastical gathering where the fate of the Templars would supposedly be decided through proper church procedure. However, everyone understood that the outcome had already been predetermined. Clement V and Philip had agreed beforehand on the order's dissolution. The council voted accordingly. The Knights Templar ceased to exist as an official institution of the Church. It was a formal erasure, bureaucratic and efficient, lacking any of the drama or justice that the proceedings pretended to represent. The Templars' property was supposedly distributed to another order, the Knights Hospitaller, but in practice much of it ended up in the hands of the French crown. This transfer of assets was in itself a crime. Church property being seized by secular government violated centuries of ecclesiastical law, but such technicalities seemed irrelevant when the full weight of royal authority was deployed. For Jacques de Molay and the most prominent surviving Templars, this dissolution meant nothing had changed about their imprisonment or their fates. They remained in custody, their confessions still considered valid evidence, their heresy still supposedly proven. By 1312, Molay had endured 7 years in prison, aged beyond his years by torture and despair. He had initially confessed to the charges, then retracted his confession, then been forced to confess again through renewed application of pain. 7 years of incarceration in medieval dungeons meant isolation, darkness, the constant threat of renewed torture. His mind and body had been subjected to experiences that might break the strongest will, and he was neither young nor strong by this point. Prison guards whispered that he seemed to be fading, that his spirit was being consumed from the inside. The psychological torment of knowing that the Church had abandoned him, that the Pope, who should have been his protector, had decided that his organization was better erased than defended, must have created a despair as complete as any physical agony. 7 years of wondering if the torture would return. 7 years of knowing that none of his confessions mattered anymore. The order was already gone. 7 years of being imprisoned not for anything he had done, but for the king's greed. In the tower at Rouen, where he spent his final years, the cell measured roughly 8 feet by 10, with a single barred window set high in the stone wall. Light entered only at certain hours, casting shadows across the floor where straw provided his bedding. Other Templars in other towers wrote that they marked time by scratching marks into walls, counting days that stretched into months that stretched into years. Some Templars went mad, their minds fragmenting under the weight of endless confinement and uncertain futures. Others developed a hollow acceptance, a resignation to conditions that would never change. De Molay endured both states at different moments. He was stripped of his role, his authority, his identity. The Grand Master who had commanded respect across Christendom was now simply a prisoner, a number, an accused heretic awaiting execution. The uncertainty was its own form of torture. Would he be released? Would he be executed? Would he die in this cell from age or illness? The waiting itself became a weapon more effective than any flame or iron. He was denied the sacraments for years, then granted them again, then denied once more, control exercised through the most fundamental aspects of religious life. Other Templar prisoners wrote that de Molay wept sometimes, though guards were instructed to tell no one. A man who had knelt in Jerusalem, who had negotiated with sultans, who had overseen military campaigns, was reduced to weeping alone in darkness. Yet something in him endured. Even in captivity, even broken by torture and despair, he maintained enough of his mind to eventually understand what had happened to him. The charges were lies. The confessions extracted under torture were worthless. The order had been destroyed not for heresy, but for greed. This realization, this clarity about the truth of the situation, became something like a spiritual strength. He had been destroyed unjustly, and he knew it. Philip now faced one final problem: witnesses. The Templars were still alive. As long as they lived, there was danger that they might publicly recant their confessions, that they might tell the truth about what had been done to them, that they might become martyrs whose treatment would inspire sympathy rather than conviction. The solution was execution, and it had to be done in a manner that made the Templars appear guilty enough that their death seemed just punishment rather than murder. On March 18th, 1314, 7 years after the arrests, Jacques de Molay was sentenced to burn at the stake. The execution was conducted on a small island in the Seine River near Paris called Ile de Havio, a location chosen to control access and ensure that the event played out according to plan. Crowds gathered as news spread through the city. Merchants abandoned their stalls. Priests left their parishes. The Grand Master of the Knights Templar was brought to the island to die, and Parisians wanted to witness it. The pyre was constructed with careful attention to detail. Enough wood to burn completely, positioned so the flames would be visible from the riverbanks where crowds had gathered since dawn. De Molay was stripped of his outer robes, left in a simple tunic, then fastened to the stake with iron chains that would hold him even as his flesh blackened and curled in the heat. He was approximately 68 years old, skeletal from 7 years of imprisonment. His hair had turned white. Scars from torture marked his body. As the flames rose around him, de Molay made a final speech, his voice, somehow, carrying over the crackling wood and the stunned crowd. He was addressing both Philip and Clement V directly, his words cutting through the noise of the burning with a clarity that eyewitnesses would remember for decades. Chroniclers present recorded different versions, but all captured the same essential fact. De Molay called upon God to judge both men within a year. De Molay's actual words, as closely as historians can determine, were, "Pope Clement and King Philip, I call upon you both to meet me before God's judgment seat within 1 year's time. Before the eternal throne of justice, you shall answer for this injustice." His voice was steady even as the flames consumed him. The legend grew that Molay, even burning, maintained his dignity, and dignity in facing death gave his words a terrible power. Some accounts claim he recanted his confessions from the stake, declaring his innocence before witnesses. Others report that he refused to cry out in pain, that he maintained composure until the flames reached his heart. What was certain was that his death was witnessed by hundreds, and his final words, whatever their exact wording, embedded themselves into popular consciousness as something more than the death of a condemned heretic. They felt like prophecy. The smoke rose in a thick plume over Paris. It was visible from the palace where King Philip held court, visible from the cathedral where prayers were being offered. Clement V died on April 20th, 1314, just 33 days after the execution, sooner than even the curse might have predicted within the year that Molay had invoked. Some accounts claim the Pope was seized with sudden illness just days after learning of the burning. He was in his mid-60s, already frail from various ailments, and the shock of Molay's words at the stake may have contributed to his physical collapse. His death was unexpected. No physician had predicted it was imminent, yet he simply began to fail, to weaken, to spiral toward mortality as if something had fundamentally broken in his will to live. Philip IV died on November 29th, 1314, not quite 9 months after the Templar Grand Master's death, also within that fatal year. The king's death was equally sudden. Illness struck him while hunting, and within weeks he too was gone. The coincidence was too perfect to ignore, and it embedded itself into history and popular consciousness with the force of religious certainty. Whether or not Molay had deliberately cursed them, and there's no evidence he was a sorcerer, or that curses carried literal power, the deaths seemed to validate his words retroactively. Both men had pressed their vendetta against the Templars to violent conclusion, and both had died within months, as if Providence itself had rendered judgment. The public understood this narrative perfectly. Hurt the innocent, and divine retribution would follow. This belief would sustain the Templar legend for centuries, transforming them from military monks into martyrs of a higher cause. But there remained one crucial mystery that fascinated historians and treasure hunters for generations. Where was the Templar wealth? The entire purpose of destroying the Order had been to seize their vast accumulated assets, their gold, their silver, their lands, their properties scattered across Christendom. Yet when Philip's men came to take inventory of confiscated Templar holdings, something was profoundly wrong. The treasure was gone. The great preceptories were found to contain far less wealth than had been expected. The vaults that should have overflowed with precious metals and jewels contained only modest quantities. Where were the mountains of gold that Templar banking had accumulated over 2 centuries? Some historians suggest that the Templars, sensing danger was coming, had already begun transferring assets in the months before the arrests. The Order had excellent intelligence networks. They must have known that Philip was planning something. Moving money across Europe through the banking networks they had established was well within their capabilities. Ships laden with Templar gold might have sailed from French ports heading towards Scotland, or Portugal, or other locations where the French king's power couldn't reach. Archaeological investigations have uncovered no major Templar treasure sites, which either means the treasure didn't exist in the quantities that legend claimed, or that it was successfully hidden and lost to history. The second possibility is more romantic, more compelling for the imagination, that somewhere beneath the soil of Europe or Scotland, a fortune in medieval gold awaits discovery, waiting for someone clever enough and lucky enough to understand the cryptic maps and hidden symbols that supposedly mark its location. This mystery gave birth to centuries of speculation, to treasure hunts that continue to this day, to legends of hidden Templar wealth that may or may not have any basis in historical reality. What we do know with certainty is that Philip IV, despite orchestrating the destruction of the wealthiest organisation in Christendom, died in debt. The hoped-for infusion of Templar assets never materialised in the quantities he'd anticipated. The wealth he'd coveted remained locked away somewhere in history, lost entirely to time and circumstance. The fall of the Knights Templar had been complete and devastating, but it had not delivered the financial windfall that had motivated the assault. Philip had won a political and military victory, destroying an organisation that had challenged his supremacy, but he had lost the economic war that he'd actually fought to win. The irony was as perfect as the curse that de Molay had invoked. The man who killed to gain wealth died without ever securing it. The legacy of the Templars' destruction rippled outward across Europe. Other monarchs watched what Philip had accomplished and learned the lessons well. Powerful organisations could be destroyed through systematic propaganda, coordinated military action, and the application of sustained pressure on ecclesiastical authorities. The template Philip had created would be used repeatedly in subsequent centuries by other rulers seeking to consolidate power or seize wealth. The Templars themselves, once erasure had been complete, became something more powerful than they'd ever been in life. They became myth. Within decades of their dissolution, legends grew that they'd escaped to Scotland, that they'd established underground networks, that they possessed secret knowledge, that their curse on Philip and Clement was real. These myths persisted and grew stronger, generation after generation, until eventually the Templars of popular imagination bore little resemblance to the historical order, but possessed vastly greater cultural resonance. The real Knights Templar had been warrior monks, administrators, bankers, and political actors, complex figures engaged in the serious business of medieval religion and warfare. The legendary Templars became something grander and darker, keepers of secrets, possessors of forbidden knowledge, victims of persecution that made them sympathetic and fascinating. Which version was true mattered less than which version people believed, and people chose to believe the legend. Jacques de Molay himself underwent a similar transformation. The elderly Grand Master who had confessed under torture, who had retracted his confessions, who had lived through 7 years of imprisonment, became immortalized as a martyr whose death came with a curse that God himself seemed to validate. His final speech on the island in the Seine, whether he actually said what was attributed to him, or whether later chroniclers invented words more dramatic than the truth, became the epilogue to an entire epoch, the moment when medieval certainty began to fracture, when even the most powerful institutions could be destroyed through conspiracy and will rather than legitimate conflict, when the rules that had governed Christendom for centuries proved fragile when tested by determined adversaries. The 13th century had belonged to the Templars. They represented the apotheosis of the crusading ideal, the ultimate expression of martial Christianity deployed on behalf of Christendom against its enemies. The 14th century belonged to forces that would destroy them. The rise of nationalism over supranational religious authority, the emergence of secular kingship as more powerful than ecclesiastical legitimacy, the realization that an organization's mythology could be weaponized more effectively than its actual power. Philip IV had demonstrated that monarchy was supreme, that the Pope himself could be pressured into submission, that the age of the Crusades and the orders that embodied them was ending. The Templars' fall marked the beginning of the end for that entire medieval worldview, the moment when the old certainties collapsed and Europe began its transition toward the modern world. Their organization had lasted for nearly 200 years, had accumulated wealth beyond measure, had commanded the respect and fear of kingdoms and popes alike, yet had been erased in a coordinated action lasting barely a week. The speed and completeness of their destruction taught a lesson that Europe would spend centuries absorbing. Power, no matter how ancient or apparently stable, could be overturned by political will and coordinated force if those forces were applied decisively enough and without mercy or hesitation. On the night of October 12th, 1307, while King Philip's soldiers arrested Templars across France in a coordinated military action, 18 ships sat idle in the harbour at La Rochelle, fully loaded with supplies and treasure, waiting for orders that would never come because their commanders had been arrested or were fleeing. These weren't merchant vessels designed for trade routes. They were the Templar fleet, the military backbone of an organization that had controlled Mediterranean trade routes and maritime commerce for 2 centuries of dominance and power. The timing was suspicious, incredibly suspicious, and worth examining closely. According to records scattered across European archives and private collections, the fleet vanished that very night, leaving no trace, no manifest, no explanation of where they sailed or why they disappeared into history. Some historians claim the ships were seized by the crown, others swear they escaped with the Templar leadership intact, sailing away with wealth of kingdoms worth millions in modern currency. What happened to those 18 ships became history's greatest disappearing act, a mystery that spawned theories ranging from the plausible to the wildly fantastical. The mystery would define everything that followed for centuries of speculation and investigation. In those 18 ships lay a fortune that would be worth billions in modern money, accumulated through 2 centuries of banking operations and crusade plunder and careful financial management. The treasure included gold coins, precious jewels, religious artifacts, and most importantly, documents. Records of banking transactions, ledgers of debts owed by European nobility, and accounts that could topple kingdoms if revealed. Whoever controlled those ships controlled European financial power. Whoever found that treasure could reshape entire nations. The night the ships vanished was the moment when European history changed direction forever, when power shifted from visible institutions to hidden networks operating in darkness and shadow. Historians have spent centuries chasing theories, each more tangled than the last, each more dramatic than the previous one, attempting to explain the impossible vanishing act that shocked all of Christendom. The romantic version claims the fleet sailed north into the Atlantic, carrying Templar wealth and refugees to safety in distant lands beyond European reach and control. The specific version names Scotland as their destination, claiming scattered records and oral traditions prove this route was taken by fleeing knights and officers. This wasn't random speculation. It fit perfectly with what was happening in Scotland at that exact moment in time when political and religious circumstances aligned mysteriously to create opportunity. The pieces of this puzzle seem to fit together too perfectly to be coincidence, suggesting historical forces working invisibly behind the scenes. Robert the Bruce, King of Scotland, was excommunicated by the Pope in 1306, which was just 1 year before the mass arrests in France sent shockwaves through Christian Christendom. The excommunication was a devastating blow to Bruce's legitimacy as a Catholic monarch and powerful ruler. It made Bruce a pariah among every Catholic monarch in Europe, isolated and desperate. Yet somehow in 1307, Robert the Bruce was preparing for his greatest military challenge, defeating English King Edward II and reclaiming Scottish independence for his people and ancestral kingdom. In June 1314, at a place called Bannockburn near Stirling in central Scotland, Bruce faced an English army outnumbering the Scots by a significant margin, possibly 2-1 or even greater. The English expected victory. They had better cavalry, more soldiers, superior resources, and centuries of military tradition backing their forces. The The English had defeated Scotland repeatedly before. They had overwhelming advantages on paper. But something went wrong for the English on that summer day. Something unexpected happened on that battlefield that changed the entire course of Scottish history forever and unexpectedly. According to Scottish sources and chronicles, mysterious warriors appeared in the battle's critical moment, fighting alongside Bruce's army with lethal precision and discipline that shocked observers. These warriors fought with extreme discipline, using tactics that looked nothing like typical medieval Scottish warfare or Highland fighting methods developed over centuries of clan-based combat. They used tight formations developed in military academies and professional training across Europe and the Crusader states. They moved like trained military units, responding to commanders with precision and speed and coordination and discipline. They responded to signals and orders like professional soldiers trained for years together in disciplined service in organized armies. The chronicler who recorded their movements noted with awe, they moved as if guided by invisible hands, each knowing what the other would do before orders were given. Eyewitness accounts described them as a hidden force from God, warriors from the west arriving like spirits, knights we'd never seen before who fought as one body with perfect coordination and unity of purpose. None of the historical records named them explicitly or identified their commanders and their leadership structure. None identified their origin or national affiliation or home kingdom of origin. None explained where they came from or how they arrived at the battlefield location in time to turn the tide of battle. None explained how they knew exactly where to position themselves for maximum tactical advantage. But the impact was devastating for the English. They routed in complete chaos, losing thousands of soldiers and their claim to Scotland forever and absolutely in a defeat that changed European power dynamics completely. Robert the Bruce won Scotland's independence on that day, and for centuries, no one could explain how victory had come against such overwhelming odds in such a desperate military situation where defeat seemed inevitable. The Scottish historian John Barber wrote decades later, "But what strange warriors fought at Bruce's side that day? Were they mortal men or spirits sent from heaven? These warriors appeared in our darkest hour and disappeared when victory was assured." The question haunted historians for generations and spawned endless debate about the battle's outcome. Were they supernatural forces intervening in human affairs to aid the righteous? Divine intervention from God to punish an unjust English king? Or something far more practical and historically grounded? The legendary Templars, arriving at the perfect moment to repay a debt owed by a king who had protected them and given them refuge. Years later, after his excommunication was lifted and he could speak freely about his past and his debts, Bruce allegedly rewarded these mysterious warriors with land in Scotland. He supposedly granted them estates, titles, and the freedom to worship as they chose, free from papal oversight or English interference or persecution. If they were Templars escaping France, this would have been the ultimate refuge, a place where a king owed them a massive debt and gratitude, where they could disappear into the Scottish Highlands and rebuild their order in secret away from persecution and arrest. The evidence for this theory comes from archaeological findings rather than written records that might have been destroyed. Graves discovered in Scotland, particularly in the borderlands where Bruce had direct influence, contain symbols matching Templar imagery perfectly and unmistakably in their details. But they also contained symbols that were ahead of their time by centuries. Masonic marks and geometric patterns developed centuries later in secret societies that emerged in England and Scotland during the 1600s. These graves had the Templar cross, the distinctive equal-armed cross identifying Templar locations across Europe for 2 centuries and beyond, marking their presence and power. But they had something else too, something entirely unexpected in medieval graves of ordinary warriors and knights, whose remains shouldn't contain such sophisticated symbols. These graves had geometric symbols used in Masonic lodges, architectural markers indicating mathematical knowledge, mathematical proportions reflecting the golden ratio that wouldn't appear in mainstream European society for another 100 years in documented history and mainstream use by common peoples. Researchers examining these graves found stone markers featuring compass and square symbols, triangular geometry, and precise measurements that could only be understood by people trained in advanced mathematics and sacred geometry. The implication was staggering and mind-altering. The Templars didn't just disappear into Scotland. They went underground completely, and possibly influenced the development of Freemasonry, a secret society obsessed with geometry, architecture, sacred knowledge, and hidden mysteries of the universe that Freemasonry would later claim as its foundation and philosophical basis. This was more than flight. This was transformation of identity and purpose. They weren't just refugees running from arrest. They were reinventing themselves completely and fundamentally and adapting their organization for survival. One particularly famous location stands out in this narrative: Rochelle Chapel, near Edinburgh, a strange structure built by the Sinclair family in the mid-1400s under unexplained circumstances. Rochelle Chapel is architecturally impossible to explain without mentioning Templar theories and secret knowledge from the medieval world. The building is covered in carvings, thousands of them, featuring symbols, botanical drawings, and geometric patterns that make no sense in a conventional Christian chapel design. Some carvings appear to show maize and aloe plants, botanical specimens that didn't exist in Scotland at that time. Supposedly, they weren't known in Europe until centuries later, according to official records and botanical histories accepted by scholars. Other carvings show precise astronomical alignments, mathematical ratios, and architectural proportions matching Templar preoccupations with sacred geometry and divine proportion in buildings designed according to divine law. The carvings include depictions of Masonic tools, compass rose navigation symbols, and astronomical charts showing constellations that wouldn't appear in mainstream European architecture for centuries to come. Why would a Scottish chapel contain plants from the Americas? Researchers asked for centuries without finding satisfactory answers that scholars could definitively agree upon based on available evidence. And why would medieval Scottish builders know astronomical alignments matched to future Masonic symbol systems? The mysteries only deepened with each investigation. The Sinclair family had direct connections to the Templars. William Sinclair was listed as a Templar ally in court records dating to the 1300s and beyond in Scottish archives. His descendants maintained hidden relationships with Scotland's underground communities and secret organisations operating in shadows across centuries of Scottish history. The chapel was built with stone from locations associated with Templar history and Templar precincts in the Holy Land and Mediterranean regions. It contains rooms that have never been officially excavated by professional archaeologists or properly studied in modern times despite repeated requests. The construction techniques used in Rochelle Chapel match Templar architectural methods found nowhere else in Scotland or England, suggesting builders trained in Templar traditions brought their knowledge north. Rochelle Chapel sits on the landscape like a message in stone, an advertisement of hidden knowledge and Templar influence radiating through generations of visitors and observers, carefully examining its mysteries and symbols carved into every surface. But the Scottish story wasn't the only one competing for truth and historical legitimacy among scholars. While ships supposedly sailed north, other Templars vanished in completely different directions toward other safe havens and protective kingdoms. The most dramatic alternative theory leads to Portugal, a nation handling the Templar crisis differently from other European powers and monarchs. King Denis of Portugal faced intense pressure from King Philip to disband the Templars and seize their assets completely and permanently. But Denis did something revolutionary that surprised everyone. He didn't disband them at all. Instead, in 1319, he renamed them completely and submitted the new organisation name for papal approval. The Knights Templar became the Order of Christ, a new military organisation under papal approval and legitimacy and official protection. The records were falsified to show transition rather than destruction, reorganisation rather than elimination of the organisation's power and resources. The Pope, carefully avoiding any direct mention of Templar identity and history, accepted this arrangement as technically satisfying papal obligations to suppress the order officially while maintaining diplomatic relations with Portugal. It was bureaucratic genius of the highest order. The Templars didn't disappear. They simply changed their letterhead and official name on all documents and records with papal awareness and subtle approval. This wasn't hiding. This was operating in plain sight under a different banner and new identity, completely concealing their nature from common people, while remaining visible to those who knew what symbols to look for. The Order of Christ continued openly in Portugal for centuries, conducting military campaigns against Islamic forces, accumulating wealth through captured lands and tribute, maintaining their organisational structure intact throughout this period and beyond. More remarkably, they directly influenced Portuguese exploration and colonial expansion worldwide. shaping world history completely through their strategic investments and carefully planned expeditions to every corner of the globe that they could reach with ships and determination. Prince Henry the Navigator, who launched the age of exploration in the early 1400s and discovered new trade routes, was himself the Grand Master of the Order of Christ officially and without question. Henry's ships, sailing down the African coast and around the world discovering new lands and peoples, carried the Red Cross symbol of the Order of Christ on their sails, visibly for every observer to recognize and understand. The symbol was identical to the Templar cross in every detail and appearance and historical meaning, down to the geometry and mathematical proportions. The connection was explicit and visible to every observer who saw these vessels on the ocean routes and trade passages, advertising the Order of Christ's involvement in exploration. Prince Henry funded expeditions not just for trade and profit, but for something deeper. The search for wealth, hidden knowledge, and lands claimable under Templar ideology and ancient ambitions related to Crusade conquest. The Portuguese explored with systematic precision that seems almost obsessive and predetermined, as if following maps or secret knowledge the Templars had accumulated during their dominance in Mediterranean maritime commerce. Why did the Portuguese explore so methodically, as if searching for something specific rather than randomly seeking trade? Historians wondered for generations without finding satisfactory explanation in official records. The Order of Christ became the funding mechanism for global exploration and colonial enterprise that would reshape world history. The Order financed Columbus and his voyage westward across unknown waters toward a destination he may have known existed. The Order equipped Magellan for his round-the-world journey of discovery that proved the world's shape and size. The Order sponsored Portuguese missions to India and beyond, establishing European colonial dominance in Asia. The wealth hidden during French destruction may have been preserved and invested strategically in exploration. It's a possibility challenging every assumption about what disappearing means historically. Meanwhile, in Switzerland, something equally enigmatic unfolded in the Alpine mountains far from major powers' attention. 4 small cantons, Uri, Schwyz, Unterwalden, and later Lucerne, began rising to power with startling speed during the early 1300s. Their ascension was suspiciously timed to match the Templar crisis across Europe precisely. In 1291, exactly 4 years before the final Templar chapters dissolved in France, these cantons formed a military alliance that would eventually become Switzerland as we know it. Their rise coincided precisely with Templar organisational collapse. The connection isn't documented in any official record, yet the timing and geographic location are too convenient to ignore completely. The cantons were in the Alps, strategically positioned between France and Italy, controlling vital mountain passes and trade routes through Europe's most challenging terrain and most difficult to traverse geography. These cantons had access to passes controlling trade and military movement throughout Europe and beyond toward the Mediterranean and toward Germanic territories to the east and north. These communities had remarkable wealth appearing suddenly in the 1290s and 1300s, without clear historical explanation for its origin or source in documented records accessible to modern historians. Local historians and contemporary chroniclers struggled to explain how 4 small mountain communities suddenly acquired the resources to challenge Habsburg power and resist outside domination through military and diplomatic means. Some Templar scholars argue this is where the main treasure went. Not to Scotland or Portugal, but to Switzerland, where protection existed in neutral mountain fortresses that could store wealth safely from all powers' reach. The evidence of sudden wealth accumulation combined with the timing of Templar dissolution creates a historical coincidence that's difficult to explain away through conventional means. The mountains provided geographic security against invasion or seizure by any power or military force that might threaten the vaults. The neutrality provided political protection no single European power could violate without breaking treaties and international agreements carefully maintained. You could hide an empire's worth of gold in those deep Alpine valleys, protected by mountain passes only locals understood. This explains Switzerland's inexplicable rise to financial dominance and secrecy, traditions beginning in the 1300s that never ended and only intensified with time. The banking structures, vault systems, emphasis on neutral territory and extreme confidentiality, all could have Templar roots in hidden history not yet fully documented. One more theory, perhaps the most famous among treasure hunters worldwide, directs attention to Nova Scotia in the Atlantic Ocean. an idea that challenges everything we thought we understood about medieval exploration and knowledge. On a small island called Oak Island, there's a structure called the Money Pit, a series of tunnels and chambers descending into the earth, filled with booby traps and flooding mechanisms designed to stop grave robbers and thieves. The pit has never been fully excavated despite centuries of attempts by investors, archaeologists and treasure hunters willing to spend fortunes trying. Its engineering is sophisticated, suggesting medieval construction techniques learned through crusades and Middle Eastern influence on European architecture. The markers found include stones bearing symbols possibly interpreted as Templar crosses and other medieval insignias that could identify the original builders and their intentions. Oak Island locals reported finding artifacts and broken pottery consistent with medieval European origin, not Native American craftsmanship. The theory claims the Templar fleet sailed west, across the Atlantic, to a location already known through secret exploration and Norse trading routes established before Columbus even existed. The Templars had connections to Norse explorers and Viking descendants who had explored beyond the known world. They possessed detailed maps showing lands Europeans weren't supposed to know about. They knew about the New World centuries before Columbus launched his famous voyage in 1492, claiming to discover lands already well known to some. The Money Pit was their storage vault, a hidden repository for the greatest treasure ever assembled by any medieval organization that had to be preserved outside Europe's political reach and powerful enemies' grasp at any cost. Some scholars point to the sophisticated engineering and medieval artifacts as proof of this theory, while mainstream archaeologists dismiss the evidence as coincidence and misidentification. So where did they go? The answer might be everywhere at once, spread across continents and oceans in a coordinated dispersal that suggests careful planning at the highest levels of the remaining Templar leadership. Different groups of Templars fled to different locations strategically chosen for maximum protection and future opportunity. Some sailed north to Scotland, where religious and political vulnerability created shelter for religious refugees and military fugitives alike. Some stayed in Portugal, reorganizing openly under a new name that fooled most observers, while maintaining everything that mattered beneath the surface completely. Some travelled to Switzerland, investing treasure in mountains that provided natural security for vaults and hiding places and banking operations that would flourish in secret for centuries. Some sailed west to the Atlantic, disappearing into legend and mythology, and potentially finding refuge in the New World before European exploration officially discovered it. The greatest evidence appeared in 2001, more than 600 years after the arrests and persecutions had long faded from living memory. In the Vatican Secret Archives, a researcher discovered the Chinon parchment, a crucial document that reframed everything historians thought they understood about the Templar persecution. This document, written in 1308 by Pope Clement V in his own hand, proved something hidden for centuries beneath layers of official silence and complicity. The Pope knew the Templars were innocent of the charges against them. The Chinon parchment stated explicitly that torture allegations were false, fabricated, and unjust prosecution of innocent men. The Pope issued a secret pardon, while publicly maintaining silence about the matter completely, making him complicit in the persecution even as he absolved them privately and in writing. How could the Pope know they were innocent and say nothing while men were burned at the stake, scholars asked in astonishment, at the incredible discovery that vindicated centuries of Templar defense. This meant the Templar organization technically had papal approval and legitimacy, papal blessing, even if secret and hidden from public knowledge and the scrutiny of secular powers. Some Templars likely carried documentation proving their innocence from the Pope himself, giving them proof they could show to sympathetic rulers and monarchs willing to defy King Philip. The parchment explained why some orders could reform so openly without papal opposition. They had proof of papal absolution in written form that could be presented to defend their legitimacy. The Chinon parchment transformed understanding of Templar persecution forever, rewriting the narrative that had dominated for centuries of Western history. It suggested the Templars weren't fleeing defeat like hunted criminals. They were fleeing injustice and political persecution at the hands of a greedy, corrupt king and his allies. They were seeking refuge not as criminals guilty of heresy and blasphemy, but as political victims of a conspiracy orchestrated for financial gain and land acquisition. The parchment vindicated them completely, proving their innocence beyond any historical doubt that could reasonably be maintained. Their disappearance wasn't an ending, it was a strategic retreat into shadows where they could continue their mission, away from persecution and pressure. They were preserving something important that had to survive beyond the reach of their enemies and attackers. They were protecting knowledge accumulated over centuries of crusades, banking, diplomacy, and sacred learning in the Holy Land. They were maintaining an organization they believed was fundamentally just, despite persecution, despite torture, despite the world turning against them in a conspiracy that would have destroyed lesser organizations. The night of October 12th, 1307, when 18 ships vanished from La Rochelle into history and legend and mystery, was when the Templar Order fractured into thousands of different paths across continents and centuries and oceans and mountains. Some paths led north to Scotland, to graves with shadowy symbols carved in stone by hands unknown to mainstream history. Some led south to Portugal, where they could wear their cross openly on ship sails and architectural stones without fear of seizure or arrest. Some led east to Switzerland, where mountains hid vaults that would fund nations and banking empires lasting to this day. Some led west to the Atlantic, to islands and money pits never fully explained or excavated, to treasures that may still rest waiting in the depths. The greatest mysteries aren't solved, they transform into something new and unexpected. The Templars didn't disappear, they dispersed intentionally throughout the world, according to plans made in secret before the arrests. They didn't vanish, they evolved into new organizations and identities and structures that protected what they were while changing what they appeared to be. What started as a military order of crusaders fighting in the Holy Land became a banking system, secret society, colonial power, global financial architecture shaping the modern world forever and continuing to shape it today. The symbols changed dramatically across time and distance. The names changed completely to confuse pursuers and create plausible deniability. The methods changed fundamentally to adapt to new environments and new opportunities. But the power persisted and grew exponentially through centuries of careful operation in shadow and secrecy. If you look at global history after 1307, you can trace Templar influence everywhere, if you know where and how to look carefully and methodically. In Scottish independence movements against English domination and conquest, in Portuguese exploration that discovered entire continents and new peoples, in Swiss banking traditions of absolute secrecy still maintained to this day, in Masonic lodges and their secretive rituals passed down through generations in secret, in puzzling carvings on tombstones and chapel walls everywhere you look carefully and thoughtfully. The question wasn't where did the Templars go? The real question was what did they become in the centuries that followed? The answer continues unfolding in history even to this day, hidden in plain sight throughout the world in institutions and families and organizations that maintain secrets no one else remembers were ever worth keeping. When the last Grand Master Jacques de Molay burned at the stake in 1314, he supposedly cursed King Philip and Pope Clement to meet him before God's throne within a year, and both men died before 1315 arrived, their reputations forever entwined with the Templars' downfall. This single moment ignited something far more durable than the order itself, a legend that refused to die, a skeleton key that would unlock centuries of conspiracy theories, secret societies, and alternate histories. What happened next is the real story of the Templars, not the one written in official chronicles, but the one whispered in the dark corners of human imagination, the one that shaped how we understand power, banks, and hidden knowledge today. Within decades of their dissolution, rumours spread that Templar survivors escaped to Scotland, to Switzerland, to the Americas, that their wealth never truly vanished but merely went underground, flowing through hidden channels of influence that would reshape European finance and geopolitics for the next 7 centuries. These weren't the fantasies of idle peasants. They became the foundational narratives of Freemasonry, the Illuminati, the Priory of Sion, and every secret society that claimed to inherit the Templars' special knowledge and mission. In coffee houses and gentlemen's clubs, in university halls and aristocratic drawing rooms, men asked the same question over and over. What did the Templars really know, and where did that knowledge go when they vanished? The answer would eventually spawn an entire industry of books, films, tourism industries, and alternative history movements that, by the 21st century, would make the Templars more culturally influential in death than they ever were in life. Understanding this legacy requires us to separate the threads carefully, which conspiracies sprang from genuine mysteries, which were deliberate forgeries designed to deceive, and which reveal something true about how institutions of power actually work when they become invisible, the Freemasons claimed descent from the Templars almost immediately, weaving together Templar symbolism, rituals, and supposed secret knowledge into their own complex system of degrees and initiations that promised enlightenment to those worthy enough to ascend the ladder. "We are the true heirs of the Temple," Masonic historians would claim, pointing to architectural terms, biblical references, and esoteric knowledge that supposedly flowed directly from the warrior monks to the brotherhood of builders and philosophers. The connection made intuitive sense to people of the 17th and 18th centuries. Templars had been wealthy, powerful, and curious. Freemasons were all of these things too, claiming special knowledge that transcended national boundaries and royal authority. The trouble is, this narrative never quite held up under scrutiny, though millions accepted it as truth, incorporating Templar imagery into Masonic lodges throughout Europe and North America, creating a kind of psychological inheritance that felt real, even if the historical one was questionable. Yet this invented connection did something unexpected and crucial. It preserved Templar symbolism and mystique during centuries when the actual historical order was mostly forgotten by the general public, keeping the legend alive precisely because Freemasonry was wealthy, organized, and willing to claim that heritage proudly. The Holy Grail legend proved even more explosive, transforming the Templars from a medieval military financial institution into custodians of the greatest religious secret of all time. The idea that they possessed the cup Jesus drank from at the Last Supper, or better yet, evidence that Jesus had married Mary Magdalene and fathered children whose bloodline survived through medieval France. This wild claim drew on medieval romances about the Grail, on confused historical fragments about medieval French dynasties, and on the deep human hunger to believe that history contained hidden layers of meaning beyond what official institutions acknowledged. The Templars guarded what the Church feared most, the proponents would say, proof that Christ's bloodline walked the earth, that the entire foundation of religious orthodoxy was built on a lie. The genius of this conspiracy theory was that it did two things simultaneously. It suggested that the Templars possessed dangerous, world-altering knowledge, and it provided a reason why that knowledge had to remain hidden, why the Templars were hunted and destroyed, why their secrets could only be rediscovered centuries later by those clever enough to decode the clues they'd supposedly left behind in architecture, art, and symbolism. None of it was true. There is zero credible evidence that the Templars possessed or sought the Holy Grail, zero evidence that they knew anything about Jesus' family beyond what any literate medieval Christian knew. But the theory had tremendous emotional and narrative power, suggesting that ultimate truth lay just beyond the reach of official history, accessible only to those willing to question authority and look deeper. Then came 1989, and Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code changed everything about how the modern world thought about the Templars. Brown's novel took all these conspiracy threads, the Grail, the hidden bloodline, the Priory of Sion, Templar secrets passed through Freemasonry, and wove them into a page-turning thriller so engaging that millions of readers accepted the fictional frame as historical possibility, if not outright truth. There was a feminine aspect to the divine that was quite real, one of Brown's characters explains, laying out a completely invented historical narrative as though it were established fact, presenting speculative ideas as certainties in ways that blurred the line between fiction and scholarship. The novel's success was astronomical. Over 80 million copies sold, translated into 56 languages, read by people who might never open another book about history, theology, or medieval studies, all of them carrying away the impression that the Templars had been guarding world-shattering secrets, and that organized religion had actively suppressed the truth. The book's influence on Templar tourism cannot be overstated. Suddenly, sites associated with the Templars became pilgrimage destinations for thousands of readers seeking to walk in the footsteps of Robert Langdon and Sophie Neveu, to decipher codes supposedly hidden in artwork and architecture, to feel they were participating in the unveiling of ancient secrets. This created a strange feedback loop where tourism dollars funded more Templar mythology, more books, more guided tours, more conspiracy theories, turning genuine medieval sites into stages for modern fantasy narratives. The Templars had become what every historical figure secretly dreams of becoming. Not just remembered, but reimagined, given new life in the 21st century imagination not as military monks, but as guardians of hidden knowledge, warriors of enlightenment, tragic heroes whose destruction could not suppress the truth they'd fought to preserve. Video games accelerated this transformation by turning the Templars into archetypal villains and heroes depending on perspective, most famously in Ubisoft's Assassin's Creed series, where the conflict between the Templar Order and the Assassin Brotherhood became a framework for exploring themes of control versus freedom across different historical periods. The Templars in these games are ruthless, organised, and convinced of their moral righteousness, believers that order must be imposed on a chaotic world, a characterization that wasn't completely unfair to the actual medieval Templars, but filtered through modern video game storytelling where the Templars always represent the oppressive establishment the player must fight against. What's remarkable about Assassin's Creed is that it exposed an entire generation, millions of teenagers and young adults to Templar history, albeit in completely fictionalized form, creating a kind of cultural consciousness where the Templars existed as a permanent institutional archetype, the organization that holds power, hoards secrets, and must be resisted by clever individuals with special knowledge and combat skills. The game's success meant that more people knew something about the Templars from Assassin's Creed than from any history textbook, their narrative about the Order and its philosophy becoming as influential as academic scholarship, shaping how millions visualized medieval knights, conspiracy, and institutional power. In the modern era, numerous organizations have claimed direct descent from the original Knights Templar, though virtually none of these claims hold up under scrutiny. The Sovereign Military Order of the Temple of Jerusalem, the medieval Knights Templar, the Chivalric Order of the Holy Sepulchre, the Order of the Temple of the Orient, and dozens of others, some legitimate charitable organizations, others essentially fraternal clubs or fantasy role-playing groups dressed in medieval costumes. These modern orders typically claim that some Templars escaped the 1312 persecutions and maintained the order in secret, eventually allowing it to resurface in the modern era, though if this actually happened, there's remarkably little historical evidence of it, no documented lineage, no institutional records that bridge the centuries from the 14th to the 21st. We are custodians of the ancient wisdom, representatives of these modern Templar orders will say, preserving traditions that the original knights held sacred, often without specifying what those traditions actually are beyond vague references to chivalry, spiritual seeking, and esoteric knowledge. These organizations serve a genuine psychological function in the modern world. They provide community, ritual, a sense of connection to history, a feeling of membership in something exclusive and meaningful that transcends the ordinary mechanisms of capitalist society. Whether or not they represent true historical continuity matters less than whether they meet genuine human needs for belonging and purpose. Though this distinction between legitimate need fulfillment and historical truth-telling is exactly the problem that conspiracy theories depend on, the confusion between emotional truth and factual accuracy. The most influential hoax in Templar conspiracy lore was the Priory of Sion, an organization that supposedly had preserved the lineage of Jesus through the Merovingian dynasty and maintained the truth about Templar guardianship of this secret bloodline, eventually surfacing in 20th century France where it became the centerpiece of multiple conspiracy books and Dan Brown's entire fictional framework. In reality, the Priory of Sion was fabricated in the 1950s by a conman named Pierre Plantard, who created fake documents, invented a false history, and deliberately planted these forgeries in French archives and libraries, specifically designed to deceive scholars and journalists who might investigate his created mythology. Plantard's hoax worked because it appealed to deep narrative desires. It suggested that French history contained hidden layers, that an ancient bloodline had been preserved, that secret organizations had shaped events behind the scenes. That ultimate truth was accessible to those clever enough to decode symbolism and question official narratives. When the hoax was eventually exposed, when scholars traced the forged documents back to Plantard's own creation, the evidence was so thorough and undeniable that the deception could not be defended, yet millions of people had already absorbed the Priory of Sion mythology into their worldview, and for many the exposure of the hoax only deepened their conviction that powerful people were actively working to suppress the truth. This is the psychology of conspiracy. Once a narrative feels emotionally true, factual refutation often strengthens belief rather than weakening it, because the debunking gets interpreted as exactly what one would expect if the conspiracy were real. Of course, they would suppress the evidence. Of course, they would discredit the researchers. Of course, the official narrative would deny what the awakened few could see clearly. The connection between the Templars and modern Illuminati conspiracy theories emerged through a similar process of invention and narrative layering, with some conspiracy researchers claiming that the Templars never truly disbanded, but rather went deep underground, eventually merging with or creating the Illuminati, a secret society of enlightened individuals who work to reshape world events according to their special knowledge and philosophical vision. The Illuminati had actually been a real 18th century Bavarian organization founded by Adam Weishaupt, a progressive Enlightenment thinker who created a society devoted to rational philosophy and social improvement, but the real organization dissolved within decades and left no lasting structure, though this hasn't prevented centuries of theories claiming that the Illuminati secretly controls world banks, governments, and major institutions. Some conspiracy theorists argue that the Templars, having survived their 14th century dissolution, either founded the Illuminati or were its most influential members, creating an unbroken chain of secret power that supposedly traces from medieval crusaders through Enlightenment philosophers to modern financial elites controlling global affairs from the shadows. This narrative is comforting in a strange way. It suggests that history isn't random, that events follow patterns, that unknown intelligent forces are directing the chaos, and if one could just decode the right symbols and access the right documents, the mechanism of power would become transparent and comprehensible. The trouble with all these conspiracy theories, whether focused on Freemasons, the Grail, the Priory of Sion, or the Illuminati, is that they obscure the real legacy of the Knights Templar, which is simultaneously less mystical and more significant than any of the invented narratives could possibly be. The Templars' genuine historical contribution was so substantial that it required no embellishment. They invented international banking. They created the financial instruments that allowed capital to flow across borders without physical transport of precious metals. They established a system of credit and deposit that transformed how wealth moved through the medieval world and laid the conceptual groundwork for every modern financial system that followed. When a Frankish merchant needed to transfer funds from Paris to Jerusalem, he could deposit his money with a Templar commandery in Paris, receive a letter of credit, and withdraw the equivalent value in Jerusalem with no actual transport of gold. A revolutionary idea that meant capital could move at the speed of written communication, rather than the speed of caravans vulnerable to bandits and weather. The Templars were doing in the 12th century what international wire transfers do today, moving money across distances instantaneously and securely, a capability that was so powerful and transformative that it made the Templars wealthier than kings and more powerful than popes, because they essentially controlled the flow of capital through medieval Christendom. This real accomplishment, genuine institutional innovation that reshaped how societies organized economic activity, is far more impressive than any mythical guardianship of the Holy Grail or secret bloodline. Yet it's this real legacy that gets buried under layers of conspiracy mythology. The Templars also funded exploration. Their capital and their banking networks enabled merchants and adventurers to mount expeditions that expanded European knowledge of the world, financed trade routes that connected East and West, and created the financial infrastructure that would eventually fund the Age of Exploration, when Columbus, da Gama, and other navigators set out to map the world on behalf of monarchs and commercial interests. Without the financial innovations the Templars pioneered, without the international banking networks they created and perfected, the Age of Exploration might not have been possible, which means that the entire trajectory of European expansion, colonialism, scientific discovery, and global integration traces back, at least in part, to financial ideas that the Templars developed in medieval Palestine and brought back to Europe, where they transformed what was possible economically and geographically. Every stock exchange in the world, every bond market, every system of credit, every mechanism through which capital flows across international boundaries owes at least some conceptual debt to the Templars' innovations, which makes their actual historical significance more substantial than the fictional narratives that have grown up around them, though far less dramatic and far less appealing to the modern imagination. The real story of the Templars is simultaneously less secret and more sobering. They weren't destroyed because they'd discovered the Grail or harboured forbidden knowledge about Jesus' bloodline. They were destroyed because they'd become too powerful, because their wealth and their independence threatened the political authority of the kingdom and the spiritual authority of the church, because an institution that could move capital around the world without answering to secular or ecclesiastical power had become a liability to everyone trying to maintain control. This is the actual cautionary tale embedded in the Templar story. What happens when an institution becomes more powerful than the governments and religions around it? When its interests diverge from broader societal interests? When it has the means to resist oversight and accountability because it controls resources that everyone needs? The Templars were destroyed not because they were uniquely good or uniquely evil, but because they represented a fundamental challenge to how power was organised in medieval society, and the institutions that felt threatened, the monarchy and the church, had sufficient power to eliminate them when they finally decided to act. This pattern repeats throughout history. Institutions that become too powerful relative to the frameworks designed to constrain them eventually face destruction or radical transformation, whether they're medieval military orders, East India companies, railway barons, oil monopolies, or modern financial institutions that have accumulated such enormous resources and influence that they function almost as sovereign powers unto themselves. The Templars' real legacy teaches us something crucial about how power works and how it persists. The financial systems and banking innovations they created outlasted the institution that created them, spreading into the broader architecture of civilization where they became so woven into normal economic functioning that we can barely see them anymore. We just take for granted that capital moves instantly across the world, that credit exists, that complex financial instruments can be created and traded, not recognizing that these possibilities emerge from ideas that medieval crusaders developed in Jerusalem and perfected in Paris. We inherit the Templars' innovations every time we use a credit card, every time we check our bank account online, every time we observe money moving from one nation to another faster than any physical object could possibly travel. Yet we attribute these capabilities to modern technology rather than recognizing that the conceptual framework was established 800 years ago by an organization that the Church burned to the ground and tried very hard to erase from history. This disconnect between what we owe to the Templars and what we actually remember about them is precisely what conspiracy theories exploit. There's genuine mystery in the gap between the official narrative of the Templars' destruction and the incompleteness of the historical record, and into that gap flows an ocean of speculation, invention, and alternative narrative that captures the imagination more powerfully than the actual history does. The real lesson of the Templar story is that historical truth is less dark than we'd like it to be, but far more consequential. They weren't guardians of ultimate secrets, they were practitioners of radical financial innovation, and that innovation was world-changing, not because it was hidden or esoteric, but because it worked, because it solved real problems, because other people adopted it and built on it, and eventually integrated it so completely into how civilization functions that we no longer remember where it came from. The Templars also teach us about institutional power and resistance to oversight. They accumulated wealth through the Crusades and through financial services, and they used that wealth to acquire land, political influence, and practical immunity from accountability, which eventually triggered a backlash from the institutions trying to maintain control, leading to their systematic destruction in a coordinated operation that took months to execute and left most of their assets appropriated by the Crown and the Church. This pattern of institutional power accumulation followed by violent elimination or radical reform is repeated so consistently throughout history that it might be considered a law. Institutions that become more powerful than the systems designed to constrain them will face pressure to dismantle them or bring them under control, and when the institutions resist that pressure, conflict inevitably follows. Understanding this pattern helps us see modern institutional dynamics with greater clarity. We can observe the same tensions playing out today in debates about bank regulation, antitrust law, technology company power, and whether institutions with enormous resources can be adequately supervised, or whether they inevitably become threats to the broader society they ostensibly serve. The Templars from this perspective were not unique in their corruption or their power. They were simply the first major institution in European history to accumulate enough independent wealth and influence that they triggered a comprehensive response designed to neutralize that power, and in their destruction, we can see the template for how societies respond when institutional growth threatens to exceed institutional accountability. The conspiracy theories that swirl around the Templars actually obscure this clearer lesson, replacing institutional analysis with mysticism, replacing historical causation with secret knowledge, replacing the sobering realization that power and corruption are endemic to human institutions with the more comforting fantasy that history is being driven by a secret cabal of enlightened or malevolent conspirators following a hidden plan. The truth is simultaneously less dramatic and more important. The Templars were destroyed because they became too powerful. The financial systems they created proved so useful that they persisted and evolved into the systems we use today. And the gap between their actual historical significance and what we remember about them created the space where conspiracy theories flourished, and where fictional narratives about grails and bloodlines could claim attention that might better be directed toward understanding how real power operates. As we move forward in an age of massive institutional power, when corporations, governments, and financial systems exercise influence over billions of lives, the Templar story offers us a lens for understanding contemporary dynamics. Institutions tend to grow until they become threats to the systems designed to constrain them, at which point they face either destruction or radical restructuring. And the way a society handles this conflict determines whether it can maintain a functional balance between institutional power and democratic accountability, or whether it descends into cycles of institutional corruption and violent reclamation. The legacy of the Knights Templar is therefore not mystical or hidden. It's written into the basic structure of how modern financial systems work, and it's also written into the pattern of institutional rise and fall that we see replaying throughout history, a pattern that tells us that power without accountability is ultimately unsustainable, that institutions become threats when they exceed their oversight mechanisms, and that the truly consequential forces shaping history are often less dramatic and less visible than we'd like to believe. Now, as we drift toward the end of this journey through medieval crusades and medieval banking and medieval power structures that still echo through the modern world, let your mind settle into the realization that history is not a mystery to be solved, but a pattern to be observed. And the greatest institutional power is not the kind that hoards secrets, but the kind that shapes how everyone thinks about money, value, and exchange without anyone quite noticing where these ideas came from. Let yourself imagine a group of warrior monks walking through the streets of Jerusalem 800 years ago, not knowing that the financial innovations they're developing in response to practical problems will reshape civilization, not knowing that their institution will be destroyed within 2 centuries, not knowing that centuries after their destruction, people will weave mythology around them because their actual historical significance seemed somehow insufficient to contain the scope of their influence. The Templars shaped the world not through hidden knowledge, but through practical genius, not through conspiracy, but through adaptation, and their story teaches us that the most important historical forces are often the ones that become so normalized, we stop seeing them as revolutionary, so integrated into ordinary functioning that we forget they were ever invented, so fundamental to how we organize society.